Thank you very much, and thank you very much for participating and listening to this, the official launch, actually, of my book on globalization. Actually, the reason why I began to write this book was the fact that I was hostile to globalization once upon a time. I found big multinational corporations and trade across borders as something harmful to people, to the environment, and to democracy. I began to reevaluate those ideas when I began to study the history of my own country, Sweden. Sweden of my ancestors in the late 19th century, which used to be one of the poorest countries in Europe, a country where infant mortality was higher, where life expectancy was lower, and the average income was lower than in sub-Saharan Africa today. What changed that was the process of 19th century globalization. The fact that my ancestors were given for the first time the right to trade across borders, to specialize in the kind of sectors where they were good at producing and import the rest from other places. It was the fact that competition was introduced in the Swedish economy that meant that corporations, companies had to improve, had to become more efficient constantly all the time to be able to succeed in the competition. When this started in the 1870s in Sweden, when Sweden became a part of the European economy in those days, of the, you could say, the World Trade Organization of that era, a free trade treaty between France and England that was being expanded to new countries constantly all the time. That was the moment when the Industrial Revolution began to happen in poor agricultural Sweden. That was the moment when living standards began to take off, when we couldn't produce enough food for our people. Swedes were starving in those days, just a bit more than 130 years ago. But we could produce a few things: iron and steel and timber and paper, and now we could export that to other countries, and in exchange we could buy the food, the things we needed to improve the lives of my ancestors. So in other words, I would probably not have been here had it not been for globalization, had it not been for the fact that 19th century trade and investments across borders made it possible for my ancestors to survive. And then I had to begin to change my mind on what's going on in the world economy, when those kinds of opportunities are being given to more countries around the world. And I find it very hard to see why some of my old political friends opposed the kind of opportunities to trade, to invest, to produce across borders that gave us the living standards that we needed. And I had to begin to discuss this matter. I traveled around Sweden to meet the anti-globalization people discussing these matters, and becoming steadily more convinced, I would say, that that's precisely the process that is needed if we want to see the kind of development of economics and of human opportunities that we saw in Sweden and other countries 100 years ago. But I also realized that it was very difficult to be in all places at once, so I thought I should write a book on the subject to sort of summarize the argument and make it possible for them to explain the whole process. And that's this book. This book on globalization that has now been translated into Czech, for which I'm deeply, deeply honored and flattered. A book that was written for a Swedish audience on globalization and its impact for Swedish citizens and Swedish companies turned out to be not very Swedish at all. It turned out that suddenly people on many different continents found the same kind of issues interesting and relevant to their own situation. I'm now counting, I think it's in about 22 countries where this book has been published. The latest editions before this one was in India and in China, and we've just got one in Urdu in Pakistan as well. So apparently on all continents except Antarctic, we can see the debate on globalization going on like this. And that's, to me, really a proof that globalization is going on, that the same kind of debate is traveling the globe like that. And I just thought that I, during this little time that I have, should discuss what the basics of what I write in this book, and the kind of things that have made this book seem relevant, I think, in different places. And why, for some strange reason, I haven't seen as much hostility to the book as I have expected, especially when I travel around the world. Especially, you could say, the poorer the country I visit to talk about globalization, the more positive people are, because they are right in the middle of that process, which gives them enormous opportunities. Countries that can straight away do what Sweden did 100 years ago, use ideas and technologies that it took other countries generations and billions to develop. They can use it straight away. They can jump in the technological development straight to the mobile phone without investing in the old systems. They can use straight away the new systems of transporting, of shipping, and of air flight across the world. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why we see globalization at all. If you're asking me about, and some people do, where I receive the most hostile attitudes to the book, I have to say France. Unfortunately, and on second place would be Quebec, the French-speaking part of Canada. That's the only places where I've seen real protests against my book and demonstrations. And perhaps we can discuss and ponder why that is the case later on. But if I'm to give you a clue, I think it's difficult to embrace the process of globalization if you still think of yourself as the sort of empire that used to be the place that set the terms and conditions for other places and other parts of the world. It's difficult then to change your mindset into understanding that you have to see where the best ideas are being developed right now and use them straight away. I think it's in many ways an opportunity, a great opportunity, to be a somewhat smaller country, like Sweden, like the Czech Republic, being more in line, understanding that the world is a big place and that we grow richer and we receive more opportunities if we can use the labor, the hard work, the ideas of other people as well. Technology and politics. That's the two reasons why we have a globalization process at all today, I would say. As I mentioned, I mean, it's nothing new. We've had this for, well, you could say for 500 years, and we've had a pretty intense globalization period in the late 19th century with that era's technological developments, the railway, the telegraph, and so on. But now we see it in an accelerating pace because we got the new technologies. Sometimes I think of my mother-in-law. She was a very early Swedish student traveling abroad to the United States, visiting there and studying for a year in the early 1960s. And in the early 1960s, being on the other side of the planet, an ocean away from your parents, you would think that you try to communicate with them and tell them that you're all right. Well, she actually called them once during this period. And of course, there was no email to communicate and tell them what's going on. Once, she tried to make that phone call during Christmas, but she had to wait in line for 2 days to get access to the Atlantic cable, because in that year, 1960, the Atlantic cable could only carry 100 phone calls at the time. It's just a bit more than a generation ago where we couldn't communicate like that, and it was so incredibly expensive to do it so that it was only one phone call. Today, of course, we see our ideas, our words being transmitted, changed into ones and zeros in the computer system, digitized and sent through fiber optic cables to the other side of the planet. And they're there about a 10th second later, and it costs almost nothing to do it today. That's the kind of change that technological development has meant. And it's not just digital communication, of course. It's also shipping, flights. You might have read the book Around the World in 80 Days. Have you? Raise your arm if you have. The book, the great French novelist Jules Verne, who was a very globalized Frenchman, wrote this book on how Phileas Fogg, the English gentleman, could travel around the world in 80 days. And it shocked the Europeans in 1870 that, I think it was around 1870, that he was able to do such a thing, even as a thought experiment. Well, today Phileas Fogg could go up at 7:50 in the morning, take the flight, and return on the other side of the globe tomorrow in time for afternoon tea at the Reform Club. And it wouldn't cost him 15 million pounds, which was the amount of money that Phileas Fogg spent in this novel. So we really have an era of globalization. And that makes it possible to integrate markets. That makes it possible to integrate people, to be able to use the labor, the ideas, the capital from other places and put them to the best of use wherever that may be. But it wouldn't be possible without the other aspect of this, the politics, the political and economic reforms that we've seen around the world in the last decades. Because if we do not open borders, political systems, deregulate, and allow the technology to flourish, it wouldn't. You can see that because there are still so many places around the world which have not deregulated and not liberalized at all. And they are the ones that lag behind. If you want to ship a truckload of goods, a truckload sending it across the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe, a 10-meter road, I think it is, something like that. The amount of paperwork, the amount of tariffs, the corruption, the licensing that you're forced to do means that this takes more time and is more expensive than shipping it all the way from South Africa to the Czech Republic. So it's not just about technological development. It's also about the political liberalization that has to take place in order for people to embrace that technological change. That is globalization. And that's something we've seen around the world with the trade liberalization since the Second World War. Industrial tariffs have come down from 40% in the European countries on average to 4% today. The fall of communism, the liberalization of the Indian and the Chinese economies, all those things means that we've suddenly created one world economy. And it is sometimes said that because of this, we've doubled the global workforce. Used to be, well, if these places hadn't been globalized, we would have about 1.5 billion global workers producing for global markets. Just because it's so cheap with telephone communications, you don't have to use them all the time. But 1.5 billion people, that's what we would have had if we hadn't seen those reforms. But today we have another 1.5 billion people who produce for other countries, who are in the global workforce. And that's something that changes everything. It connects places, it connects people, it makes it possible for people who have talent to receive the investments, the capital, the machinery, to produce new things for other markets, to do the things that Swedes were able to do 100 years ago and made us rich. And that's why we also see the same development in so many places around the world today. I've traveled to many different places in Asia and so on to look at the conditions in so-called sweatshops, sweatshop factories. Poor people working for a tiny wage under slave-like conditions, according to a lot of critics to the globalization process. And what you can see when you travel to places like this is the first factor, that the workers you talk to, their most common complaint to management is, please, could you expand these factories soon so that my relatives are also able to get jobs like this? Because on average, if you work for a foreign company, a multinational in one of the world's low-income or middle-income countries, you receive twice the wage that you would if you work for a similar domestic company. Not because the multinationals are more generous, not because they are trying to save the world, but because they are more globalized, because they bring in the best kind of management ideas that they know about, they bring in the latest technology and the latest machinery, they bring access to other markets. And in that case, the average worker is able to produce more, and if they can produce more, they can also earn more and receive better working conditions. That's what's going on in the world right now, as we speak. Bill Gates recently explained that had he had a choice 40 years ago on where to be born, as an average person of average talent in a tiny American city, or as a genius in Shanghai or in Mumbai in India, then he would have preferred to be the average person in the small American city. Because all those opportunities existed there that made life better. Access to education, to ideas, capital, investments, all those things that gave you a good life. Today, Bill Gates says, because of a connected world, I would prefer to be a genius in Shanghai or in Mumbai. Because now, in an interconnected world, ideas and capital and investments are able to find talent and genius wherever it is. Something that for many people, especially in Western Europe and in places like France and Italy, people say that this is horrible. This means that we will face competition from all those geniuses in Shanghai, in Mumbai, in Central and Eastern Europe, and what will happen to us. You know that saying, if someone is really special, you are 1 in a million? Well, that means that the Chinese have another 1,300 people like that. And the Indians have another 1,000 people like that. Of course, it's easy to see the problems and the challenges in that case. But look at the other way around, which I'm trying to do in my book. Isn't it something amazing that goes on in the world when we stop wasting talents and geniuses to the extent that we have in the last hundreds of years? That people who have the best ideas, the people who could have become the next Bill Gates or the next Leonardo da Vinci, that they are able in an interconnected world to give those ideas and those business ideas and systems and goods and services to the rest of the world. That's something that gives us all more opportunities, better technologies, more ideas that we can use to improve our lives. If we are open to that process, if we are constantly looking around the world for the best ideas and the best things that can improve our lives. Just look around at the amount of ideas that suddenly are able to flourish in a globalized world. I think today that we have more scientists and researchers around the world than we have had in all the earlier eras of mankind's history combined. And all of them receive an education that is almost as long as an average life in earlier eras. More people in freer countries than ever are able to produce more ideas than ever before. For the first time we had any kind of statistics on science in the United States at the universities, 1870. That year, one person received a PhD. One American received a PhD. During this time that I have been talking, I think that 2 Americans received their PhD. And if we combine that with all the other places around the world, with Europe, with India and China, tons of people are receiving their PhDs as we speak, which gives us more ideas, more books that we have to read when we write our papers that can receive the prizes here up on the stage. Of course, it's easy to also find that there's some kind of information stress going on. In 1992, around the world, we had a total of 4 websites on the internet. 4 websites. Today, we have 4 websites per person around the world. It's a lot of reading we have to do. But it also means that we have more access to more ideas, more things that can be developed to create new things. At Berkeley University, the University of Berkeley, there's a project going on where they try to measure how much information and texts has been published ever. In books, on cave walls probably, in papers, on the internet and so on. And so far their calculation, with a reasonable margin for some ignorance here, so far, their calculation says that of all the information that has ever been published around the world, half of it was published in the last 3 years. So in other words, more than ever for us to use if we are open to that development. And the more we have to lose if we are not open to that development. This also means that we can create more than ever. And that is what we are doing around the world. We have probably created more wealth, and we have increased human life expectancy more in the last 50 years than in the 50,000 years before. In just the last 20 years, we've cut extreme poverty in half around the world. About 40 people have been lifted out of extreme poverty around the world every minute in the last 20 years. In the last 30 years, we've cut hunger and undernourishment in half. We've reduced child labor around the world in half in the last 25 years. We increased life expectancy in the last 50 years by about, in the last 60 years by about 20 years around the world because of more incomes, better technologies, more access to drugs, medicines, and so on. Every time we make old things cheaper by producing them in a more efficient way, our purchasing power is increased, and then we can use it to create the new things, to research in better ways, to increase our life expectancy, and so on. 20 years of increased life expectancy in 60 years. Can you imagine what that means? It means that if I talk here for 45 minutes, your life expectancy has increased in 15 minutes by the end of it. Isn't that quite an interesting world? But of course, we are not there yet everywhere. There are enormous inequalities around the world. Despite the fact that we've reduced absolute poverty, people who live on less than $1 a day in half since the early 1980s. We still have more than 1 billion people who live under those circumstances. And we still have, in so many places in Europe and in America, people who do not have access to the best ways of the best companies, employment in those sectors that can really produce for the world markets. Partly because of inefficiencies on our own labor markets, which hold us back, keep us in the old sectors that cannot compete around the world as they should. So there is a long, long way to go because of that. We see huge parts of the world which are being completely shut out of this process. Africa, and especially sub-Saharan Africa, is a place in the world where poverty is on the increase. A place where hunger is increasing, despite these tremendously positive developments that we see around the world. Now, why is that? It's because it also happens to be the least globalized, the least open economies, the least open societies around the world. When I recently traveled to Kenya, I visited the huge slums of Nairobi, the capital, where millions of people live under the harshest circumstances imaginable. And you would expect that people around in those places sit around idly without devoting energy to hard work, to labor, and that's the reason why they're poor. But people are not. People are active. People are innovative. They create, in every corner, they create a new shop. They produce things, goods, services for other people in the slums. They try to constantly improve on their own small houses in those places. They try to illegally connect their own houses to the electricity grids, to the water systems, and so on. They try to improve their lives constantly. But they have to devote so much of that energy, so much of that hard work, to trying to avoid the government's interventions, the regulations, the corruption that constantly destroys their opportunities of improving their lives. When I talked to people in that slums, and no one had the right officially to produce anything, to sell anything to anybody else. They were all in the informal sector, in the informal market. They didn't have a license to do what they did. And they told me that just to do the simplest things, just to make a piece of bread and sell to your neighbors, you need 11 government permits. from 11 different bureaucrats. And that means that 11 different people who have your fate in their hands will extort you and demand bribes in order to allow you to do things like that. Just the official costs, except the corruption, amounted to something like half a year's of income. Half a year's income. And if you don't know if you're able to give your children food the next day, you will not be able to save half a year's income to start a business in the formal sector in a more open way and being able to produce at large scale. And this means that everywhere in the slums people are facing a lot of policemen who ask them if they have a license, who ask them if they have the 11 different permits to do what they're doing. And if they don't, well, then they're able to, then they simply demand bribes in order to allow you to do the things you do. They have a saying in the slums of Nairobi, it's not safe to carry cash around in the slums because there are too many policemen. And the policemen, they're out after your money. And under those circumstances, you won't be able to, you have to hide from the governments, from the authorities, and if you hide from the authorities, you also hide from your potential customers and consumers. And that's a really bad way of doing business. You can't do it large scale, you cannot invest in it in a bigger way, since you don't even have the legal title to the plot you have, the agricultural land, if you have that, the house you live in, or the business. You cannot borrow money, you cannot borrow capital to invest, to create this more large scale in different ways. When I was around traveling in the agricultural lands, yes, sure, you see some big men who have their enormous plots, who have been able to get access to the government. They are able to have it as private property. And they can do just fine. But if you don't, you can't. Simon, one of the farmers I met, he told me about his dream. His dream was to improve his plot, to get irrigation, to get water on the land, to increase the production. If he could borrow money to do that, he would be able to increase his production and his income so much that he would be able to pay back the money soon. But it wasn't his land. It was formerly owned by the government. And the moment he improved on it, people, friends with the bureaucrats, with the politicians, could seize the land from him. And since he didn't even own the land formally, he didn't have any collateral to invest, to get the capital to do the things that he needed to do. So in other words, production has to be small scale, without the latest technologies, without using all the access to ideas that we see around the world, to improve on this in different ways. And in that case, if you can't produce large scale back home, you don't get the benefits of scale, the economies of scale, and you cannot produce large scale globally. Globalization begins at home. It begins by giving people, empowering people, giving them property rights, giving them the opportunity to start a business, to produce and to trade across borders without interference from others. And that is why I think that globalization is really not just about opening borders. It is about opening societies and giving people the opportunity to participate, to become a part of a capitalist system, of a global capitalist system, to produce for people wherever they happen to be. So what do you do in such a place as Kenya? Well, one of the sectors I looked at was the food processing industry, and especially the meat industry. How do you create a modern, large-scale meat production system in a place where you do not have reliable access to electricity? We don't have refrigerators, ways of keeping it cool, and so on. Well, you don't really. It's extremely difficult to do that. About half of all the food that is being produced is being wasted. It goes into the waste baskets and not into people's stomachs because of bad infrastructure and bad communications. People, potential consumers from restaurants or shops who want access to fruits, to meat, they go to the particular place where they hope that there's a delivery coming. Since they don't have any access to telephones because of the government monopoly that has made it impossible for people who do not live in the most urban centers, in the most wealthy regions, it means that you do not know if there is a delivery coming. You will have to sit there for hours and wait for it. That's a way of wasting people's lives, time and energy. And at other times, no one shows up, and instead the food is just spoiled. One of the reasons why we see undernourishment around the world, not just in Kenya. I was in India recently, saw precisely the same kind of thing. But almost half of the food products are wasted before people get access to them. Well, that is now beginning to change in a big way because of a small innovation, the mobile phone. The mobile phone, a technology that wasn't invented in Kenya, that wasn't developed in Kenya, that wasn't produced in Kenya, but because of a more open global market, because of suddenly some sort of competition in the economy. At least 2 companies were allowed to compete with each other in mobile phone systems in Kenya. But I was told that not 3, that wouldn't be possible because the government ministers owned the shares in those 2 companies and they weren't interested in too much competition. And that suddenly made it possible for people to buy a phone, or if that was too expensive, to rent a phone from someone else and just shop around, asking, is there any delivery coming? And the places where they had deliveries could call the consumers and tell them that something was coming. Food isn't spoiled in the same way. People's lives and time is not spoiled in the same way anymore. But it also means something greater than all of this. It's not just about communications and the production that it makes possible. I think it's, at heart, it's about opportunities and human freedoms. It is about the opportunity of people, a farmer, for example, who have always been dependent on a local monopolist. Someone who has been traveling around and buying his goods at the price that he chose because there is no other alternative. Suddenly this is an opportunity for him to reach for the mobile phone, call other markets, other potential consumers somewhere else and ask them, what's your potential price? Would you be interested in buying this at a slightly higher price than this local monopolist? It's more than being given a higher price for your goods. It's more than more efficient markets. It is about dignity. It is about the kind of dignity that opportunities, choices gives to people who have never had it before. That's at heart, I think, the kind of process that globalization is about. To some extent that's happening even in countries like Kenya. A very, very unreformed and unglobalized economy can do things like that because of the, I think, $200 billion that have been spent by private industry in investing in mobile phone communication systems around the world in developing countries. I think that those countries who have invested like that have done much, much more good when they invested the money in those sectors than when they sent the same kind of resources as foreign aid straight to the government ministers who used them for all other things than producing opportunities for people to do the kind of things that they wanted and needed with their lives. I mean, take Nigeria. It should be one of the richest places on the planet because they've received $300 billion in oil money in the last 25 years. $300 billion. And Nigeria is now poorer than it was before it got those money. In other words, poverty is not a result of a lack of resources. Poverty is a result of the lack of the opportunity of creating resources by yourself. A lack of human resources and human opportunities to become independent and to create and to develop things like that. And that's why I think that globalization really deserves a defense. Deserves a defense against all those regulators, all that corruption, all those protectionists who try to shut borders and close off societies from each other. But it's not just about domestic obstacles, domestic problems to globalization. We also have the external obstacles. When I was in Kenya, it was to do a documentary program for British television. I showed these problems of this economy, but we also thought that we need something to show that this is not determined, that there are no opportunities. We have to show the positive examples, the opportunities that can be realized when people get the new opportunities. So we looked around, and we didn't find any good opportunities and good industries, except one that was really thriving in Kenya, the flower industry. Flowers that are being exported around the world, to Europe. And I traveled to these places, to the flower farms, the rose farms, and I talked to them. I asked them, why is this? Why is it that your industry has been able to succeed, whereas all the others are stagnating? And they said, well, we're much smarter than they are. We're more hardworking. We're better. And that made good one-liners for the show. But you also had to ask them, but okay, but why is it that you're able to be smart and hardworking in this industry and not in others? It's the same kind of soil. It's the same kind of cheap labor. It's the same kind of weather to produce other agricultural goods, for example. Why isn't that as successful? And then they said, oh, yeah, sure, there's another aspect as well. We are allowed to sell our goods. They are not. And of course, that makes a big difference to the kind of opportunities a company could have. Because the European Union, a place with a great inner market, which creates more opportunities to opening markets, not as much as I would like to see, but nonetheless, a lot of new opportunities that didn't exist before, has at the same time raised enormous barriers and protectionist tariffs, quotas against the rest of the world. And you can see this, for example, in this contrast between flowers and agricultural goods. Agricultural goods are shut out by the Common Agricultural Policy from Kenya. But the European Union made an exception for horticulture and for flowers from Kenya, because that wasn't really competing with a very strong special interest in the European Union. So that was allowed, and then that industry really boomed and flourished, you could say. Sorry for that pun. But in other sectors, people didn't get those opportunities. You know, it's sometimes said that around the world today, when we see reforms going on in China, more people believe, I think, twice as many large percentage believe in free market capitalism in China, according to the surveys, than in France. With the reforms in China, with the economic reforms in places like Vietnam and so on, we only have 3 really harsh communist planned economies left around the world. And that's North Korea, it's Cuba, and it's the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union. Because that is a system with fixed prices, with tariff barriers that close Europe from the market forces internationally, and in huge networks of subsidies that creates overproduction, which has to be dumped in other places where they could produce better, cheaper for us as well, but they cannot stand the competition, not with our farmers, but with our treasuries and with our taxpayers' money. It's a battery of all those things that keep them out. And because of that, the Kenyan agricultural market cannot flourish. Because of that, we have much higher food prices in our stores than we would have otherwise. There was recently a calculation done by the OECD that said that the 30 or so OECD countries, richest economies in the world, they spend about $1 billion every day on agricultural subsidy and protection, in subsidies and increased prices. $1 billion every day. That's a lot of money. And it's almost difficult to comprehend the size of those resources that are being used in this way. So we need some sort of measurement to compare it to something. And it's actually as much money that you could spend it to give all the cows in the in all those OECD countries, 60 million cows, a first-class, business-class, around-the-world air ticket every year. And they would still have $2,000 each to spend on stopovers to buy tax-free goods. That's how much money we waste in inefficiencies in our economy, to give our consumers less choice and to destroy the opportunities of other countries to produce things we could buy from them instead. And therefore, we also see a lot of problems, a lot of countries who do not get access to this. Even though they could reform back home, they would also need to see European reform like that. It stopped because there's some special interests in the European Union and in other places who are afraid that, okay, if we open up to shoes and textiles from China and Vietnam and agricultural goods from Latin America and Kenya and so on, what are we going to do in the future? What kind of jobs are we going to have in that case? I think that's one of the reasons why we see so much anxiety and fear for the globalization process. This kind of mentality that, look, this is the kind of things we used to do. What are we going to do in the future if we face competition from the rest of the world? It's natural. It's only natural that we see that kind of fear, because the things that we are going to produce tomorrow, in most instances, we do not know what that's going to be. That's what an open economy is all about. That's what innovation and entrepreneurship is all about. To create new things, new solutions, new goods and services. William Nordhaus, the American economist, recently tried to calculate how many of the goods and services that we used every day that even existed in some form 100 years ago. And his conclusion was that about 3/4, about 75% of everything we use every day didn't exist in any kind of way 100 years ago. In that era, they would have said, if we do not produce agricultural goods with about 50% of the population, what are we going to do in the future? Because we didn't see all the kind of new jobs that openness and entrepreneurs and innovators created all the time, and will create if we allow that constant restructuring to go on around the world. In that case, if that happens, we don't know what we are going to do in the future. But we know that most of us who sit here today will be working have at least one job in the future, doing something that doesn't exist today, doesn't even exist in the wildest dreams of most people around the world. 1.5 billion new workers in the economy. That has a profound effect on a lot of things, on wages, on ideas, on resource prices, on goods around the world. But 1.5 billion people who begin to have a stake in the global economy, begin to get an income, will want to do something with those resources in the future. It means 1.5 billion new consumers in the future as well. It has been estimated that we will see in 10 years' time the purchasing power of India, China, Russia, the Asian economies and so on, will be about as much as we see in Western Europe today. And in that case, those individuals, those companies, those countries who are open to this process, who begin to change their attitudes and their mindset to produce the kind of things that they need, and to move up in the value chain to produce better and improved goods, and use the new innovations, the new research that is taking place in other places as well, from India and China as well. They will be the winners tomorrow. And those countries, those companies, and those individuals who fear this development, and therefore also try to create the barriers to this, they will be the losers, because they won't get access to all those new ideas, to that competition, to that research that we all need to improve. So globalization creates a lot of challenges for us as well, and that's my final point. We have to have the kind of openness in our minds and in our policies that makes it possible for us to use all that human creativity that is being set free around the world right now. We need the labor markets and the product markets to be as open, as free and flexible as possible, to be able to stop doing old things in old ways, because someone else will always do that better, and try to do the new things in new ways and create enormous value for us and for people around the world. That is our challenge. We have the best opportunities that the world has ever seen to make the whole world into a more democratic, free and globalized world if we all do that. That's why I wrote that book, to explain that kind of things to my old friends who are still opposed to international trade, to multinational companies and things like that, to explain that, look, perhaps we made a mistake, and perhaps it's time to make up for that mistake. And that's what I try to do and contribute with my book. And so I come to the end of my speech here. And by the way, while you have been listening to this, another 1,800 people around the world have been lifted out of extreme poverty. And your life expectancy has been increased by 15 minutes. Congratulations and thank you.